When you ask people what the worst trade in the history of the Minnesota Vikings is, everyone's going to point to one answer, and one answer only: the Herschel Walker trade. And I'm not going to deny that. The Herschel Walker trade absolutely sucked for Minnesota and lives on in infamy all these years later for a reason. Walker did next to nothing as a Viking, and the capital that the Vikings ended up giving to the Dallas Cowboys set the franchise back by stripping them of a bunch of draft picks and enabled Dallas to build a dynasty that would last throughout the 1990s. It was a bad trade, and I'm not going to play contrarian on that whatsoever. However, as bad as that trade was, at least there was some logic behind it. Did it work out? Absolutely not. Was it good logic? Of course not. But there was some logic and rational thinking behind what the Vikings did when they acquired Herschel Walker. They thought that they were one running back away from the Super Bowl, especially after they stunk on the ground in 1988 and their top rusher, Darren Nelson, had under 400 yards and was clearly on his last legs. They didn't think that the Cowboys would activate all of the clauses in the trade to get the first-round picks. They thought that the high price was worth it if Walker could get them over the hump and help them win it all. Again, I am not saying this trade was good and that this trade worked out for Minnesota, as it was clearly a failure and might be the worst trade in NFL history, even if John Hadle and Deshaun Watson have something to say about it. But you can at least follow the logic with why the trade happened and understand what their thought process was. The trade that we're going to talk about, however, nope, not at all. Because this man right here is quarterback Kent Nix. You probably had no idea that he was a member of the Minnesota Vikings in the first place. You probably had no idea that at one point, the former Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback donned the purple and yellow. And to be honest, I'm not even sure the Vikings realized it either. Because when the Vikings acquired Kent Nix, they did so in a way that truly made no sense whatsoever, as their logic for making the trade was so completely backwards and nonsensical that it deserves a deep dive more than half a century later. Even though this trade was nowhere near as disastrous or as impactful as the Herschel Walker trade, and no one's going to pretend otherwise, this trade probably made less sense than that for reasons that you'll see in just a bit. Because this is the story behind the Kent Nix trade, otherwise known as the dumbest trade in Vikings history that you probably never heard of before. Make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel, because we post every single day on here about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL with stories like this one that you may not have heard of before. So if you like that sort of stuff, then this is definitely the place for you. Thanks in advance for liking and subscribing and for helping this community out. And with that in mind, let's talk about the Kent Nix trade that should have been nixed. Before I talk about the actual incident in question and just how bizarre it was, we need some context to understand just who this man right here is, and why one team was looking to get rid of him, while another team was looking to acquire him. This man right here is Kent Nix, and for the previous 3 seasons, he was donning the black and yellow, representing the Pittsburgh Steelers. And while Nix had his moments with Pittsburgh, most notably a 1967 game against the Dallas Cowboys, where he threw for over 300 yards and earned the praise on the opposite sideline from the legendary Hall of Fame head coach Tom Landry, Nix really struggled at the quarterback position more often than not. Over his 3 seasons with the Steelers, Nix went 3-9 as the starter and threw 14 touchdowns on 33 interceptions, posting a touchdown-to-interception ratio worse than 1-2. In 1968, Nix was one of 20 quarterbacks in the National Football League to attempt at least 100 passes. Of those 20 quarterbacks, Nix ranked 19th in passer rating and ranked dead last in completion percentage. I charted those 20 quarterbacks here with their inverse ranking, so the further you are to the top right, the better. Nix is nowhere close to the top right, I'll just put it like that. That red square seemingly in an island all by itself, that was Kent Nix during the 1968 season, as in the last year he started any games in Pittsburgh. By 1969, the Steelers had a new head coach in Chuck Noll, and Nix had fallen out of favor. And by 1970, it was very clear that the Steelers were going to move on from their turnover-prone, ineffective quarterback, as they had two other options that they deemed to be viable, with Terry Henratty, their second-round pick from 1969, and Terry Bradshaw, their first overall pick from 1970. I think that one turned out pretty well for them. But while the Steelers were looking to dump a quarterback, the Vikings were potentially on the market to acquire one. The 1969 season was a great one for Minnesota, as they made it to the Super Bowl for the first time in franchise history, going 12-2 before losing to the Kansas City Chiefs in an upset. However, the quarterback for that game and the quarterback for that entire season, Joe Kapp, was not on the roster heading into 1970. It's a bizarre saga that I'm not going to dive too much into because there are so many moving parts with this. But tensions between the Vikings and Kapp were pretty tumultuous. Kapp was playing the entire 1969 season without a new contract, and he was a free agent, with the Vikings and Kapp unable to come to terms in what would eventually be the subject for an antitrust lawsuit against the NFL years later. This is all to say that Minnesota had some major question marks at quarterback. Gary Quazzo was going to be starting for them. That much we knew, and you can learn more about the bizarre way that the Vikings acquired him from the Saints by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Behind him, they had Bob Lee and second-round rookie Bill Kappelman out of Florida State, both of whom were question marks, even though Lee had his moments off the bench in 1969, and Kappelman had a solid start to the preseason in 1970. Maybe Nix could be a viable backup option and be just what the Vikings needed. And with that, on September 2nd, 1970, the Minnesota Vikings and Pittsburgh Steelers executed a trade for the man you've been watching this whole time. Minnesota needed a quarterback, and Pittsburgh needed to get rid of a quarterback. And so, the Vikings gave up a fifth-round pick to the Steelers in exchange for Kent Nix. I should note that this fifth-round pick was not conditional. A lot of times, when you see a trade get made during training camp, even back then, there is a condition attached to the pick, where the trade is called off and no picks are issued if that player gets cut. In any other world, the Vikings and Steelers do this trade for a pick that only goes to Pittsburgh if and only if Kent Nix makes it onto the roster. However, the Vikings did not do that. They just gave up their fifth-round pick to the Steelers just like that. And look, you don't want to be giving away picks like that, but especially back in 1970, when scouting was primitive and very few people knew what they were doing due to the lack of film and lack of resources available, and you were throwing darts at a board in the later rounds, and when many players decided not to play football because the pay wasn't great and they wanted to pursue other business ventures, you didn't want to give up fifth-rounders like that easily. Once you got past the fifth round, the odds of finding someone who was going to play a single snap of professional football, let alone contribute, were not in your favor at all. As an example, the previous year in 1969, of the 10 players that the Vikings drafted past the fifth round, only 3 of them played a single snap in professional football, and only 1 played a snap with the Vikings. I'm not saying that you're guaranteed to find a star in the fifth round by any means, but the fifth round was, generally speaking, the last round back then where you'd find a player that you were reasonably certain would play at least 1 snap in the NFL. So that was a high price to pay for a player, especially back in 1970. But that's not an issue if Kent Nix made it onto the team. Obviously, I'm not anti-trading picks for players, and if Kent Nix proved to be a good quarterback for the Vikings, or even man that backup spot well, then I don't have an issue with this and with not having strings attached to the pick. What I do have an issue with is the fact that a trade happened on September 2nd. And on September 15th, not even 2 weeks later, before the start of the regular season, and with Kent Nix on the team for no time at all, the Vikings decided to cut him. Now, Minnesota was out a fifth-round pick for a player that wasn't even on their roster. Minnesota went with 3 quarterbacks to open up the 1970 season, and Nix was not one of them, as Gary Quazzo would be starting with second-round pick Bill Kappelman and Bob Lee backing him up. That was an absolute bust of a trade, with Minnesota losing their 5th-round pick before the season even began on a player that was there for the time it takes you to blink. But, okay, bad trades like that can happen. This trade stunk for the Vikings, obviously, and now the Steelers got a 5th-round pick for a player that wasn't even on the roster, as they basically got a 5th-rounder for free. But if there was sound logic behind the trade, even if the result stinks, I would understand it. If Nix did something to get himself cut, like argue with the coaches, or show up late, or berate the players and not buy into the system, I would understand it. If Nix got injured, I would understand it. If Nix outright stunk and just didn't look like a quality quarterback, I would understand it. But the logic for why the Vikings cut Nix was astonishingly bad and made you wonder why they even made that trade in the first place. Head coach Bud Grant is an incredibly smart and bright man. He's an absolute legend. He's arguably the greatest coach to never win the Super Bowl, and he's a Hall of Famer for a reason. Grant usually knew what he was doing, and you can learn more about him by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But in cutting Kent Nix, he said the reason he did it was because it takes a while for quarterbacks to learn a new system, and he wasn't going to be ready to learn the system by the start of the season. As Grant said, Nix joined us late, so it would probably take him another 3 weeks before he would know our system. In other words, Kent Nix wasn't going to know the playbook and the ins and outs of our system before week 1, so we cut him, because it usually takes 5 weeks to learn it, and we can't afford to have a player on the roster who doesn't know it. Which raises the obvious question, why the actual heck would you trade for him if that was the case? How stupid is that? You can't afford to have players who don't know the full playbook. Quarterback is not a plug-and-play position. You need to know the full playbook. By Bud Grant's own admission, it takes 5 weeks to learn the full playbook and learn the system. You trade for a guy 2 weeks ago, and shocker, he doesn't know the full playbook because you said it takes 5 weeks to learn it, and then you cut him. Am I taking crazy pills here? It's not like you traded for Nix in early July and he still doesn't know it, and you're letting him go for that because you expected that he know it by now. You traded for a guy, gave him an impossible goal that no one could possibly hit by your own admission, and then cut him when he doesn't hit that goal, all while screwing yourself out of a draft pick in the process, and a high and a valuable one at that. Am I missing something here? I'll tell you what this is like. Let's say you're a boss and you're hiring someone for your company. You spend a ton of money and resources in this interview process and in the hiring process, and you decide that you're going to hire a guy named Adam. On the first day, Adam has to watch a video about professional conduct in the workplace, sexual harassment, and all of that. The module takes 6 hours. There is no option to skip any parts of the module or speed it up, and there is no option to take the test until after the module is complete. In other words, it's going to take a minimum of 6 hours to complete this. 4 hours in, and even though Adam is watching the videos and is on pace to finish in roughly 6 hours, the boss is furious at Adam for not having finished the module yet, so the boss fires him. Why'd you hire him? Why on earth would you hire him in that regard? Why waste all those resources and all that time to hire a guy only to fire him when he can't complete the first task that, by your own admission, can't be done that quickly? Just absolutely backwards logic there. And it's the same with the Vikings and the Kent Nix trade. The logic just doesn't make sense. Either make the trade earlier or don't make the trade at all. Or keep Nix on the roster and have him learn the playbook as the season goes on. But don't do this if you knew the goal wasn't going to be hit and you knew that Nix was going to fail. You're just screwing over yourself. I'm not even saying that you're screwing Nix over in this. Though it stinks for him, he wasn't going to make it onto the Steelers anyways, and he'll land on his feet. And oddly enough, he did, as he got signed shortly after by the rival Chicago Bears. in an amazing twist of fate and in an incredibly ironic moment, Nix won AP Offensive Player of the Week in Week 2 of the 1971 season as a member of the Bears, when he came off the bench and threw 2 touchdown passes against, you guessed it, the freaking Minnesota Vikings. But you can't recover from this. That 5th round pick? Gone. Poof. Vanish. Can't get it back. Can't get a do-over. All because you used some of the most asinine logic in making this trade that I cannot wrap my head around more than half a century later. Was this trade catastrophic? Obviously not. The Vikings were still more than fine throughout the 1970s. Would they have hit on that 5th round pick if they had it? Who's to say? I don't know. I will say that the Vikings did not draft well at all in 1971, as outside of Jeff Wright in the 15th round, they did not make a single pick that I would classify as a good one. But while this trade didn't set the franchise back in the long run like some other ones, it still might be one of the stupidest trades ever, just from a logistical standpoint. Just because it wasn't catastrophic doesn't mean it wasn't stupid. If you trade for a guy because you want him to succeed and you like him, and then you give the guy an impossible goal to hit, you can't be shocked when that player doesn't hit the goal. If it takes 5 weeks to learn a system, you trade for a guy 2 weeks before the season starts, and he still needs 3 more weeks to learn the system, you have no one to blame but yourself for making the move and screwing yourself over. It's funny, because if Bud Grant said literally anything else for the reason behind cutting Nix, I'm not making this video, and this trade is largely forgotten about. If he said that he got outplayed in practice, or they were impressed with the other 3 guys they had, or that Nix wasn't as sharp as they would have liked, even if he said nothing, this isn't much of a story. It's the fact that this was the logic behind the trade that makes it all the more bizarre and all the more confusing. Because if your reasoning behind making the trade, in essence, was that you were always going to cut him, then I don't know why you make the trade in the first place. Because in 1970, the Vikings wished very quickly that they could have nixed the trade for Kent Nix. Check out our live streaming schedule for the next few days. We're live every single day on this channel, whether we're covering a sporting event or playing GeoGuessr or just taking your requests. So make sure you like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single time that we go live and so that you can join this community. Also, thanks to all our members and our Patreon supporters who get exclusive perks like their name at the end of each video, members-only Q&A streams, and cool emojis to use on videos and during streams. See how you can join this community and become a member or a Patreon member by clicking the link in the description below.